The freezing sleet that fell upon the lawless mining town of Deadwood Creek in November of 1887 did not fall straight down. It blew sideways, driven by a howling, malicious wind that turned the unpaved Main Street into a slick, ankle-deep, freezing swamp. The air smelled of sulfur, wet wool, and the heavy, rotting odor of desperation. Ada stood at the edge of the general store's covered boardwalk, her breath pluming in thick white clouds. She was 23, though the deep dark circles under her eyes and her gaunt, underfed frame made her look like a fragile ghost wrapped in a threadbare, patchwork shawl. Her right leg hung at an unnatural angle, the femur shattered in a childhood carriage accident and left improperly set by a drunken town doctor. The leg was severely shortened, the muscles permanently atrophied, leaving her to rely entirely on a crude, splintering piece of hickory wood tucked under her arm to support her weight. Beside her, completely ignoring the biting cold, stood Harlan. He was a wealthy, sadistic man whose waistline was as thick as his wallet. He owned the livery, the supply store, and the crushing, inescapable debts of Ada's deceased father. He viewed Ada not as a woman mourning her family, but as a slow, broken mule that he had a legal right to work to the bone until the ledger was clear. "Move the grain, girl," Harlan barked, his voice sharp and impatient over the hiss of the sleet. He pointed a fat, gloved finger at a 50-pound burlap sack of horse feed sitting on the dry boards. "The teamsters are waiting at the livery. You've got 5 minutes before I dock your day's ration." Ada didn't argue. She knew the consequences of a docked ration meant another night shivering with a hollow, agonizing ache in her stomach. She leaned heavily on her splintering hickory crutch, wincing as the rough wood bit into her bruised armpit. With trembling, blue-tipped fingers, she reached down and hauled the heavy, freezing sack of grain up, resting it awkwardly against her good left hip. The sheer weight of it made her twisted right leg scream in protest. She took a step off the boardwalk and down into the freezing muck of the main street. Her thin, worn leather boots immediately sank an inch into the mud. She took another step, planting her crude crutch to swing her bad leg forward. But the freezing sleet had been insidious. Beneath the surface layer of soft, churning mud lay a hidden, jagged slick of solid black ice. The tip of her crutch hit the ice. It didn't grip, it skidded violently outward. Ada gasped, the sound instantly stolen by the wind. The heavy sack of grain violently altered her center of gravity. Her good leg buckled, her twisted right leg completely unable to support her falling weight. She crashed heavily to the frozen earth. The thick burlap sack hit the mud beside her, bursting open at the seam and spilling expensive, dry oats directly into the freezing, filthy slush. Ada's face slammed into the freezing mud, the icy water instantly soaking through her thin shawl, biting deeply into her fragile skin. Her crutch clattered away, landing completely out of her reach. "You stupid, crippled bitch," Harlan roared, stepping off the boardwalk. He didn't reach down to help her. He didn't check if the agonizing fall had broken her ribs. His face was twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage over the spilled grain. A dozen hardened, mud-soaked miners, exiting the saloon across the street, stopped to watch the spectacle. They didn't intervene. In Deadwood Creek, cruelty to the weak was considered free entertainment. A low, ugly chorus of laughter rippled through the freezing air. Ada scrambled frantically in the mud, her hands numb and shaking, trying desperately to push her upper body up, reaching blindly for her lost crutch. Her twisted leg throbbed with a sickening, hot agony that made her vision swim with aggressive black spots. "Look at her crawl," Harlan sneered, his voice loud enough to carry over the wind, playing directly to the laughing crowd. "Like a broken dog, I should put you down and sell your hair for what you owe me." If you are liking this story, please subscribe. I know you must have subscribed by now, so let's continue. Ada finally managed to push herself up onto her hands and knees, shivering so violently her teeth chattered loud enough to hear. She stretched her trembling fingers out toward the wooden crutch. Harlan stepped forward. He raised his heavy, brass-tipped leather boot and planted it squarely, violently onto the center of Ada's back. He didn't just step on her, He shoved all of his considerable weight downward. Ada cried out, a sharp, breathless sound of pure agony, as she was violently flattened back into the freezing, filthy muck. The mud filled her mouth, the freezing slush instantly soaking into her dark hair, blinding her entirely. The laughter of the miners peaked, a dark, cruel sound that vibrated deep in Ada's chest. The humiliation was an absolute, suffocating weight, far heavier than the fat man's boot on her spine. "You're not moving until you pick up every last oat with your teeth," Harlan commanded, twisting his boot slightly against her bruised ribs. The laughter of the miners suddenly, inexplicably died. The sound simply ceased, cut off as if a heavy curtain had been dropped over the entire street. The heavy, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of massive hooves churning the frozen mud echoed loudly over the sleet. Harlan frowned, keeping his boot firmly planted on Ada's spine, and turned his head. Stepping out of the blinding, driving sleet was a giant. He was a walking, breathing monument of pure, untamed violence. He stood easily over 6.5 feet tall, his massive chest and broad shoulders draped entirely in the thick, coarse, heavily frosted hides of a massive grizzly bear. Beneath the wide brim of a dark, rain-soaked hat, his face was a terrifying, heavily bearded landscape of hardened lines, and his pale, slate-gray eyes burned with a cold, dead, absolutely lethal fury. He led a massive, heavily laden pack-horse behind him by a thick leather lead. Kalen, the Stone, Vance. He was the phantom of the Bloodroot Range, a feral, silent savage who lived higher than the tree line, in the jagged, impassable peaks. He descended into the mud of the mining towns only twice a year, and he brought the absolute, terrifying silence of the wild with him. He didn't stop at the hitching post. He walked directly into the center of the street. His pale, slate-gray eyes locked onto the fat man standing with his heavy boot planted squarely on the back of a shivering, mud-soaked girl. Kalen didn't speak. He didn't issue a threat or demand an explanation. He dropped the heavy leather lead of the pack-horse. He closed the distance between them with a terrifying, explosive speed that entirely defied his massive, towering bulk. Harlan barely had time to register the giant's approach before Kalen's massive, heavily calloused bare hand shot out. The giant's thick fingers wrapped entirely around the collar of Harlan's expensive wool coat and the thick, fleshy scruff of his neck. With a sheer, horrifying display of brute force, Kalen violently yanked backward. Harlan shrieked, his heavy boot flying off Ada's back as his feet were literally swept out from under him. The fat man hit the frozen mud on his knees with a sickening crack. But Kalen wasn't finished. He stepped over Ada's shivering body. He brought his other massive hand up, placing both palms squarely against the back of Harlan's head. With a sudden, brutal, downward thrust of his thick, powerful shoulders, Kalen shoved Harlan's face completely, violently into the freezing, filthy slush. "Eat it," Kalen rumbled. His voice was a deep, gravelly vibration that seemed to originate from the granite cliffs themselves, rough, unused, and terrifyingly calm. Harlan thrashed wildly, his muffled screams bobbling through the freezing mud. He clawed frantically at Kalen's massive wrists, but the giant's grip was absolute, an immovable vice of pure iron. Kalen held the tyrant face down in the freezing muck until the man's thrashing grew weak, forcing him to literally swallow the filthy, icy dirt he had just shoved the crippled girl into. The crowd of hardened miners was entirely paralyzed. They didn't reach for their revolvers. They simply stared in absolute, unadulterated terror at the giant draped in bare fur. Kalen finally released his grip, stepping back as Harlan collapsed sideways into the slush, gasping, weeping, and vomiting freezing mud onto his expensive coat. Kalen reached into the heavy leather belt at his waist. He pulled free a thick canvas pouch. He opened his massive hand and let the contents drop directly onto Harlan's heaving chest. 6 heavy, solid nuggets of raw, uncut mountain gold hit the wet wall with a heavy thud. It was a king's ransom, pulled directly from the hidden bedrock of the high crags. "The girl's debt," Kalen stated, his slate eyes dead and cold. "Is cleared." He turned his broad, massive back on the stunned, terrified men. He walked heavy-booted through the freezing slush toward where Ada lay shivering, curled tightly into a ball in the mud. Ada squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the feral giant to drag her away by the hair, waiting for the heavy, brutal hands of the beast to claim his purchased property. Her twisted leg throbbed, completely useless. She had no crutch. She had no voice left to scream. Instead, she felt the sudden, shocking heat of a massive body kneeling close to her in the mud. Kalen didn't reach for her hair. His massive, scarred hands slid beneath her shoulders in the crook of her knees. He lifted her from the freezing mud with a shocking, breathtaking gentleness, ensuring his thick arms fully supported her twisted right leg so it did not hang and pull at her ruined hip socket. He carried her to his massive black horse. He reached up, unbuckling the heavy iron clasp at his throat, and shrugged off the massive, incredibly thick grizzly fur mantle. The freezing sleet instantly bit at his canvas shirt, revealing the sheer, terrifying breadth of his heavily muscled chest, but he ignored the cold entirely. He gently set Ada sideways into the deep leather saddle, wrapping the heavy, luxurious fur completely around her shivering, mud-soaked body, cocooning her entirely. He swung up behind her, his broad chest acting as an impenetrable wall of heat against her freezing back. He wrapped one thick arm securely around her waist. As the massive beast surged forward, carrying the scarred, broken girl away from the muddy, cruel mining town and toward the freezing, unforgiving moor of the Bloodroot Range, Ada clutched the heavy fur tightly around her throat. She was finally out of the mud, but the absolute, paralyzing terror remained. The stone of the mountain had simply purchased her to take into the dark. That dark was not an empty void. It was a physical, crushing weight that swallowed the narrow, treacherous trail the moment the massive black horse stepped past the timberline of the Bloodroot Range. The freezing sleet of the valley floor rapidly hardened into a driving, horizontal blizzard, a blinding white curtain that erased the muddy, cruel mining town and the laughing faces she had left behind. Ada sat rigidly sideways in the deep leather saddle, her fragile, underfed frame entirely enveloped in the massive, crushing weight of the grizzly bear fur. The altitude made the air punishingly thin, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of ozone, crushed ice, and the deep, rich smell of the pine resin clinging to the giant's clothes. The cold here was malicious, seeking out the edges of the heavy pelt to bite at her exposed, mud-caked ankles. But the most agonizing, blinding pain came from her own ruined bones. Without her crude hickory crutch to stabilize her, the dead weight of her twisted, shortened right leg pulled painfully against her misaligned hip socket with every single lurch of the massive horse. The old, improperly set femur throbbed with a sickening, rhythmic agony that synchronized perfectly with the heavy hoofbeats striking the frozen switchbacks. It felt as though her marrow was filled with splintered glass, grinding together with every shallow breath she took. She squeezed her eyes shut, tears of pure, silent torment tracking down her mud-streaked cheeks, soaking into the thick fur collar. She survived the brutal, hours-long ascent only because of the mountain of a man seated directly behind her. Kalen was a furnace of dense muscle and heavy canvas. His broad chest acted as an impenetrable windbreak against the howling gale, and the thick, unyielding arm he kept wrapped securely around her waist was a rigid tether, keeping her from slipping off the saddle and down into the black, invisible ravines. He did not speak. He did not urge the horse faster. He simply endured the punishing elements, a natural, breathing extension of the jagged, storm-shrouded crags. Just as the last vestiges of feeling entirely left Ada's toes, the massive horse crested a steep, treacherous ridge of solid black granite and let out a heavy, vibrating snort of exhausted steam. Emerging from the blinding squall was a fortress. The cabin was not merely built upon the mountain. It was constructed directly into a massive, natural cleft of a towering granite cliff face. The front facade was built of heavy, unpeeled black pine logs, chinked tightly with hardened clay, but the roof and rear walls were solid, immovable stone. It was a dark, brooding monument to absolute, unyielding isolation. There were no welcoming plumes of smoke from the Fieldston chimney, no warm light spilling from the heavy shuttered windows. Kalen swung his massive leg over the saddle and dropped to the earth, his iron-shod boots hitting the deep snow with a heavy, definitive thud. He did not ask if she was well. He did not offer a gentle hand. He knew she could not stand. He reached up, his heavily calloused hands completely spanning her small waist, and lifted her from the saddle. He carried her through the knee-deep drifts. His grip was shockingly steady, ensuring his thick forearm fully supported her twisted right thigh so the ruined limb would not dangle and pull at her hip. But his touch was clinical, entirely devoid of warmth. He looked straight ahead, his face a shadowed landscape of dark beard and melting frost, deliberately averting his pale, slate-gray eyes from her deformed leg. He kicked the heavy oak door open. Ada swallowed the thick knot of humiliation in her throat as he carried her over the threshold. The cabin smelled intensely of trapped time, deep wood ash, curing leather, and a profound, suffocating loneliness. Kaelin struck a lucifer match against the doorframe, lighting a kerosene lantern hanging from a ceiling joist. The dim yellow light revealed a single, cavernous room. A heavy stone hearth, choked with cold, grey ash, dominated the stone back wall. In the corner sat a massive bed frame built from thick birch branches, piled 2 feet deep with the incredibly thick, luxurious skins of wolves and buffalo. A heavy wooden table, scarred by axes and skinning knives, sat in the center of the swept dirt floor. Kaelin walked to the heavy bed and deposited her gently onto the edge of the furs. The moment he released her, he took 2 large, rapid steps backward, as if her mud-soaked clothes had burned him. He grabbed a single, thin wool blanket from beneath the heavy pelts and threw it onto the hard, packed earth floor near the drafty front door. "The bed is yours," Kaelin stated, his voice a flat, gravelly scrape that offered absolutely no comfort. He still refused to look at her twisted leg, staring intently at the iron latch of the door instead. "I sleep by the draft. There is a barrel of fresh spring water in the corner. Clean the mud off yourself. I have to bed the horses in the lean-to and secure enough wood to outlast the storm. Drop the heavy iron bar on the door when I leave." He grabbed a massive, heavy-headed felling axe from the log wall. He didn't wait to see if she understood, nor did he offer to fetch her a walking stick. The heavy oak door slammed shut, the iron latch falling with a terrifying finality, leaving Ada completely alone in the echoing, isolated silence of the mountain. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, the cold seeping through the freezing, filthy mud caked onto her threadbare dress. The rejection stung far worse than the freezing wind. He had paid a king's ransom in raw gold to pull her from the muck, yet he treated her like a diseased, broken stray he had taken in out of begrudging, pitying obligation. He was giving her the bed, taking the freezing dirt floor for himself, but his refusal to look at her deformity was a wall thicker than the granite cliff enclosing them. "I will not be a useless burden," Ada thought, a sudden, fierce spark of absolute iron will igniting in her chest, burning away the lingering chill of the mining town. "Holland shoved my face in the dirt because he thought I was a broken mule. I will not sit shivering in the dark waiting to be treated like one here." She forced herself to move. Without her crutch, every single inch of progress was an exercise in pure, blinding torture. She slid off the heavy furs, landing on her good left leg. She hopped, her right hand gripping the rough bark of the birch bed frame for balance, dragging her twisted right leg behind her. She reached the heavy wooden water barrel in the corner. The water was paralyzingly cold, covered by a thin layer of ice she had to crack with her bruised knuckles. She stripped off the soaked, filthy, mud-caked shawl and dress, leaving them in a discarded puddle on the floorboards, a final shedding of Deadwood Creek's cruel world. The freezing air of the cabin immediately raised violent goosebumps across her pale, gaunt skin. She dipped a clean linen rag into the icy water and scrubbed the freezing mud from her face, her arms, and her shivering torso. The humiliation of standing practically naked, balancing awkwardly on one leg in the freezing dark, brought hot tears to her eyes, but she aggressively blinked them away. In a heavy wooden chest at the foot of the bed, she found a stack of clean, incredibly oversized flannel shirts. She pulled one on, the soft, thick fabric a stark, wonderful contrast to the coarse, wet wool she was accustomed to. The hem fell entirely past her knees, swallowing her fragile frame. She surveyed her new domain. The massive stone hearth was choked with 2 feet of cold, grey ash and caked in a thick, greasy layer of soot. Ada hopped toward the center of the room, her hand landing heavily on the back of a thick, solid oak chair sitting at the table. She gripped the top rail tightly. It was heavy enough to bear her weight. Using the chair as a makeshift walker, she pushed it across the swept dirt floor toward the hearth. She found a heavy iron ash shovel and a tin bucket. She sank to her knees before the massive stone fireplace. The simple act of bending sent a rush of blackness across her vision, the misaligned tendons in her right hip screaming in absolute protest, but she gritted her teeth and shoved the heavy iron spade into the compacted ash. She hauled the heavy, freezing soot out, clearing the hearth down to the bare, blackened stone grate. Her bruised hands shook violently under the weight, the skin of her palms raw, but she did not drop it. She dragged herself over to the woodpile stacked near the door, loading her arms with fresh, dry pine splits, and crawled back to the hearth. She used a handful of dry moss to build the fire from a struggling, smoking flicker into a roaring, heat-producing blaze that finally chased the damp, oppressive cold entirely from the cavernous room. The orange firelight danced wildly across the jagged rock ceiling, casting long, shifting shadows. In a small root cellar beneath a loose floorboard near the table, she found his larder, shriveled winter tubers, dried wild onions, and a heavily sorted cut of elk meat that had grown hard as wood. She hauled a heavy cast iron pot to the barrel, filled it with water, and swung it directly onto the hottest part of the blazing coals. Using his heavy butcher knife, she threw her entire, meager upper body weight onto the handle to slice the tough meat, tossing the pieces into the boiling water. Every single movement was a grueling battle against her own ruined body. Reaching for the high wooden shelves sent a hot spike of agony down her spine. Her right leg throbbed with a dull, radiating heat, the muscles cramping fiercely. But she stirred the rich, savory stew, the mouth-watering aroma filling the stale, lonely air of the cabin, masking the faint smell of wet fur and isolation. By the time the heavy oak door finally rattled violently on its iron hinges 2 hours later, Ada's muscles were trembling uncontrollably. She stood near the hearth, her left hand gripping the heavy oak chair tightly to keep her weight entirely off her bad leg, holding a heavy wooden spoon in her right hand. Kalen burst into the room with a violent gust of blinding white snow. He was a snowman built around a core of solid granite. Ice clung to his dark, wild hair in thick icicles. He kicked the door shut, leaning his massive weight against it to drop the heavy iron bar into place, sealing out the lethal cold. He expected the dark. He expected the freezing, empty silence of a cabin that had not felt the touch of a woman in half a decade. He expected a broken, weeping, terrified creature huddled in the corner of his furs, paralyzed by her pain and the sheer, overwhelming trauma of the muddy street. He stopped dead, his massive chest heaving beneath his canvas shirt. The air was blazing hot. The yellow glow of the roaring fire danced across the clean, swept dirt floor. The overwhelming, rich smell of salted elk and wild onions hit him like a physical blow. And there, standing by the fire, her head turned toward the door, was Ada. She was wearing his oversized flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled up past her delicate elbows. Her face was flushed from the heat of the flames, completely devoid of tears, her chin raised in a silent, unbroken defiance. Kalen slowly stripped off his soaked, freezing leather gloves, the wet hide peeling away with a heavy, wet sound. He walked toward the hearth, his heavy boots silent on the packed earth. He looked at the bubbling pot of stew. He looked at the meticulously clean stone grate, free of the deep soot that usually coated it. He looked at her. He knew the sheer, mind-numbing physical agony it would have taken a woman with a severely deformed, shortened leg, a woman without a crutch, to haul heavy ash, scrub iron, and lift heavy pots of water. He had stayed outside in the freezing blizzard chopping wood to spare her the terror of his terrifying, blood-soaked presence while she wept in the dark. He hadn't averted his eyes outside because he was disgusted by her limp. He had looked away because he was utterly disgusted by the cruel, vicious world that had broken her and then shoved her face in the mud. She hadn't wept. She had worked. Kalen stared down at her, his pale, slate-gray eyes locking onto her wide, exhausted gaze. The terrifying, feral mask of the mountain beast cracked entirely, revealing a profound, silent, earth-shattering awe underneath. He didn't see a crippled girl or a useless burden. He saw a survivor forged of absolute, unbreakable iron, whose dignity was infinitely stronger than the men who had forced her into the dirt. The giant did not speak, but the sudden, profound shift in his pale, slate-gray eyes altered the entire atmosphere of the sweltering cabin. Kalen stepped forward, his massive frame eclipsing the dancing orange firelight. He reached out, his thick, leather-clad fingers, still damp from the freezing sleet outside, closing gently over the wooden handle of the heavy spoon she held. He absorbed the physical weight of the task. Gently, with an undeniable, irresistible pressure, he guided Ada away from the blistering heat of the stone hearth. He pressed a large, calloused hand lightly against her uninjured shoulder, a silent, absolute command to sit. Ada obeyed, using the heavy oak chair to lower herself onto the thick timber bench. The moment her weight left her good left leg, the adrenaline of her desperate, agonizing chore finally evaporated. Her misaligned right hip joint popped audibly, and she let out a long, shuddering exhale, her chest heaving beneath the oversized flannel shirt. Kalen took the spoon, stirred the rich, thick elk stew, and ladled a massive portion into a deep tin bowl. He brought it to her, placing it carefully on the scarred oak table before her, and pressed a heavy iron utensil into her trembling, raw hand. He didn't demand gratitude or offer a gruff explanation for his previous coldness. He simply fetched his own bowl, sat heavily on the hard dirt floor beside the door, keeping true to his word that the bed was hers, and ate in the quiet, firelit warmth she had fought through blinding physical agony to create. The silence between them shifted in that heavy, cavernous cabin. It was no longer the tense, suffocating quiet of a feral killer and his terrified, farted captive. It was the fragile, deeply respectful stillness of two solitary, deeply wounded creatures recognizing the iron will in each other's eyes. But that fragile warmth was entirely swallowed by the mountain over the next 48 hours. The blizzard that descended upon the Bloodroot Range did not merely blow. It shrieked like a wounded, massive animal, a continuous, deafening roar that battered the thick black pine logs and the solid granite walls with the concussive force of a runaway locomotive. The temperature plummeted so violently that the moisture from their breath crystallized in the air the moment they stepped away from the roaring hearth. 10 feet of hard-packed drift snow sealed the heavy oak door completely shut, burying them alive in a twilight world of heavy shadows, dancing firelight, and absolute claustrophobic isolation. Kalen had ventured out into the blinding whiteout on the second morning, determined to pull fresh meat from his high-altitude snares before the storm trapped him entirely. When he finally returned, kicking the heavy door shut against the howling gale, he dragged the frozen carcass of a mountain sheep behind him. But the fluid, terrifying grace of the stone was entirely gone. He was sweating profusely. Despite the freezing draft leaking through the heavy log chinking, thick, greasy beads of perspiration clung to his dark, heavily bearded face. His breathing was incredibly shallow and raspy, his massive left hand clutching his right flank with a desperate, white-knuckled grip. He took 2 heavy, dragging steps toward the table. The moment his thick fingers reached for the timber bench, his knees simply ceased to function. He didn't stumble, he collapsed like a felled oak. He crashed heavily onto the packed earth floorboards, the heavy iron felling axe at his belt clattering uselessly against the stone. A violent, full-body tremor seized his massive frame, his teeth chattering so hard the sound vibrated in the small room. Ada leaped from the bed, grabbing the heavy oak chair to use as her makeshift walker. Her heart seized with a pure, unadulterated terror. The man who had effortlessly shoved a wealthy tyrant into the mud was suddenly brought low by a microscopic, unseen enemy. She did not freeze in hysterics. She hopped frantically to his side, dropping to her knees on the dirt floor, her hands flying to his face. His skin was radiating a lethal, unnatural heat, burning straight through the thick canvas of his shirt. He groaned, his pale slate eyes rolling back slightly in his head, entirely consumed by a sudden, violent, bone-rattling fever. Ada's eyes darted down to where his hand was clutched against his side. The thick canvas shirt was torn, soaked through with a fresh, dark, horrific stain of blackish-red blood. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the collar of his heavy shirt and yanked, her small, bruised hands working frantically at the bone buttons, tearing the fabric away to expose his massive chest and right flank. The sight made her breath catch painfully in her throat. Deep in the thick muscle of his ribs were the jagged, violently inflamed puncture wounds of a timber wolf's bite. The flesh around the tearing marks was an angry, necrotic purple, radiating a blistering heat and weeping thick, yellow infection. The freezing cold of the blizzard had driven the sepsis deep into his bloodstream. She had to get him directly in front of the fire. She wedged her bare left foot against the dirt floor, hooked her small arms under his massive, heavily muscled shoulders, and threw her entire body weight backward. The agony that shot up through her shortened, twisted right leg was blinding. A white-hot spike that made her vision swim with aggressive black spots in her throat taste intensely of copper. Her misaligned femur ground brutally against her ruined hip socket, the atrophied tendons screaming in absolute protest, threatening to tear completely from the bone. But she bit through her own lower lip, tasting her own blood, and dragged his 250-pound frame, inch by agonizing inch, across the floorboards until he was lying directly on the thick buffalo furs near the roaring hearth. She fetched a heavy iron kettle, filled it with packed snow from the windowsill, and swung it directly onto the hottest part of the fire to boil. From his supply sacks in the root cellar, she frantically dug out bundles of dried herbs, recognizing the sharp, bitter scent of willow bark for the fever and thick, waxy pine pitch to draw out the infection. When the water reached a rolling, furious boil, she steeped the bark into a dark, pungent tea. She cleaned the gruesome wolf bite with a rag soaked in the boiling water, ignoring his unconscious, guttural groans of agony as she scrubbed the black, infected blood away. She packed the deep punctures entirely with the raw pine pitch, binding his ribs tightly with clean strips of linen torn from her own petticoat. She dragged his heavy upper body up, resting his sweat-dampened head against her thigh, and forced his locked jaw open, trickling the bitter willow tea down his throat until he swallowed instinctively. But the freezing chill of the septic fever had already set deep into his heart. He began to shake with a violent, terrifying rigor, freezing to death from the inside out despite the blazing fire just inches away. Ada stood up. Her fingers, stiff and trembling, unbuttoned the oversized flannel shirt she wore. It pulled at her feet. She stripped down to her thin, threadbare cotton chemise, the freezing drafts of the cabin immediately raising goosebumps across her pale, gaunt skin. She dragged the heaviest grisly pelts from the bed, piling them over his massive frame on the floor. Then, she lifted the edge of the heavy furs and crawled underneath them, pressing her soft, fragile, shivering body directly against Kalen's massive, freezing, convulsing form. The shock of his icy skin against hers made her gasp, a full-body shudder racking her frame, but she forced herself to wrap her small arms tightly around his broad chest. She pressed her softly beating heart against his rigid ribcage, tangling her twisted right leg gently with his thick thighs, burying her face into the crook of his burning neck. For an hour, he shivered violently, his massive body convulsing against hers. Ada held on tight, a warm, unyielding anchor in the freezing blackness. Slowly, agonizingly, the shivering began to subside as the willow bark in her shared body heat fought the infection. His breathing deepened, the shallow, erratic gasps smoothing into a heavy, rhythmic rumble. Then, the fever fully took his mind. As his massive body fought off the sepsis, he thrashed weakly beneath the furs, his mind slipping rapidly into the dark, agonizing corridors of his past. "Sarah," Kalen mumbled, his voice a broken, raspy scrape that tore at Ada's heart. "Sarah, run. Get behind me. I'll kill him." Ada held him tighter, her hand gently stroking his sweat-dampened dark hair. "Hush," she whispered, her voice soothing and quiet over the howling wind. "You're safe. He can't hurt her." He didn't hear her. His large, calloused hand came up, grasping blindly in the dark beneath the furs until his thick fingers locked onto the fabric of her chemise. "I couldn't run fast enough," Kalen wept, a single, hot tear tracking down his heavily bearded cheek. It was a sound of absolute, devastating heartbreak that shattered the terrifying image of the stone entirely. "My legs were too small." He hit her with the iron. "I couldn't reach her in time. God, I was too slow." "I'm sorry, Sarah." Ada froze, the breath leaving her lungs in a quiet, devastated rush. The feral isolation, the terrifying reputation, the absolute refusal to look at her twisted leg. It wasn't disgust for her deformity. It was absolute, crushing guilt and self-hatred. He had failed to protect his younger sister from a violently abusive man when he was just a boy, simply because he hadn't been fast enough to cross the room. He avoided looking at her crippled leg because every time he saw a vulnerable person who couldn't run, he was violently reminded of his own childhood failure. He despised the cruelty of civilized men like Harlan because he saw the ghost of the man who had murdered his sister in every tyrant's eyes. "You are not too slow anymore," Ada whispered fiercely, hot tears spilling down her cheeks, falling onto his fever-hot chest. She held the broken giant with a fierce, protective tenderness, wrapping her arms as tightly as her aching body would allow. "You were here. You crossed the street for me, Kalen. You saved me." His thrashing ceased. The frantic, rolling motion of his eyes beneath his closed eyelids slowed. The heavy, suffocating grip of his guilt seemed to loosen just a fraction at the feel of her quiet, steady heartbeat against his chest. He sank into a deep, healing, dreamless sleep. By the time the gray, watery light of dawn filtered through the frosted chinking of the logs, the blizzard had finally broken into a quiet, spent sigh against the granite cliff. Kalen opened his eyes. The delirium was completely gone. He felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the furs, the dull, deep, throbbing ache in his bandaged ribs, and the astonishing, overwhelming heat pressed along the entire length of his body. He turned his head slowly. Ada was asleep, her face inches from his own. Her dark hair was splayed across his massive arm. Her thin arm was thrown over his torso, her soft body pressed intimately against his hardened muscle. But as she slept, the heavy furs had slipped down slightly, exposing her legs to the pale morning light. The severely shortened, twisted bone of her right thigh and the misaligned, heavily bruised knee were completely uncovered. Kalen did not look away. He did not avert his gaze to the floorboards or the door. He looked directly at the physical deformity that Harlan had mocked, the broken limb that the entire mining town had treated as a cruel joke. He remembered the blinding agony of the freezing chill, the blackness, the absolute certainty that the wolf venom was shutting his organs down. And he remembered the searing heat of the bitter tea, the soft, desperately strong hands pulling his heavy clothes away, and the fierce, beautiful voice that had called him a savior when he only saw a failure in the mirror. The broken mule, from the freezing mud, had dragged his 250-pound frame across the floorboards without a crutch. She had forced her twisted, agonizing joints to bear a crushing, impossible burden simply to save his life. Kalen shifted his massive weight, moving with agonizing care so as not to wake her. He reached his large, heavily calloused right hand out from beneath the heavy blankets. He didn't see a broken thing. He saw the profound, absolute iron it took to survive the breaking. With a touch lighter than a falling snowflake, his rough, weather-beaten hand hovered over her right leg. Gently, with breathtaking reverence, he rested his wide palm directly over her misaligned, scarred knee. Ada shifted, letting out a small gasp of pain as she woke, her eyes slowly fluttering open. She looked down, immediately realizing how exposed her twisted limb was to his intense gaze. The memory of the miner's cruel laughter and Harlan's mocking words flashed in her mind. Panic washed over her, hot and suffocating. She scrambled backward, trying to pull the heavy grisly robe down over her leg, her cheeks flushing with hot shame, desperate to hide her uselessness from his view. "Don't hide from me," Kalen whispered, his voice incredibly deep, rough, and entirely devoid of the cold, dead slate that had defined him. He didn't let her pull the fur down. He gently caught her wrist, keeping the blanket back. He kept his massive hand resting gently, protectively over her twisted knee, his thumb lightly stroking the scarred, bruised skin. He didn't pull away in disgust. He didn't treat it like a cursed, ugly thing. "They called you a broken animal," Kalen rumbled, shifting closer, closing the microscopic distance between them, and pressing his heavy, bearded forehead gently against hers. "They shoved you in the dirt because they were weak, blind cowards." He leaned in, his eyes swimming with a profound, earth-shattering awe. "You carried my life when I was dying," he whispered, his thumb brushing the scar tissue once more. "You didn't have a crutch, Ada. You dragged a dead weight across this floor with nothing but your own will. You are the strongest thing on this mountain. You are entirely beautiful." He leaned down and pressed a soft, lingering, impossibly gentle kiss directly onto the scarred, twisted skin of her knee. A kiss of absolute, holy reverence that instantly shattered the cruel humiliation of her past forever. Which country are you watching this video from? Please let me know in the comments below. The warmth of that impossible, reverent kiss lingered on the scarred, twisted flesh of Ada's knee long after the deep winter finally exhausted its furious, freezing hold on the Bloodroot Range. Over the following months, the isolated, heavily fortified black pine cabin transformed from a dark, brooding den into a sanctuary of profound, echoing warmth. Under Kalen's massive, impossibly gentle hands, the suffocating shame that had defined Ada's entire life was systematically dismantled. He did not ask her to hide her limp. He adjusted the heavy timber chairs to better suit her, and he spent 3 straight nights meticulously carving a sturdy, smooth-sanded hickory walking stick tailored perfectly to her grip and height. He treated her shortened leg not as a broken, useless defect, but as a physical testament to her unbreakable survival. The feral, terrifying giant who had forced a man to eat mud treated her with a quiet, holy devotion that completely rewrote the cruel reality she had always known. But as the brutal high country winter surrendered to the violent, rapid thaw of spring, the absolute peace of the mountain was loudly, violently shattered. The meltwater did not merely trickle, it roared. Rushing cataracts of black, icy slush tore through the jagged granite ravines, carrying heavy boulders in their frothing, icy jaws. And with the melting of the 10-foot snowdrifts came the predators of the valley, hungry for the raw mountain gold and desperate to soothe a deeply bruised, arrogant pride. It was a crisp, brilliantly clear Thursday morning. The air inside the cabin was sweltering, carrying the rich, sharp scent of roasting chicory and boiling water. Ada stood at the massive stone hearth, her weight resting comfortably on her custom hickory stick, preparing the morning coffee in a heavy, solid cast-iron pot nestled directly in the blazing coals. Kalen sat at the heavy oak table, his massive, heavily scarred hands running an oiled cloth over the lever action mechanism of his heavy Winchester rifle, the rhythmic, metallic snick-clack a deeply domestic, comforting sound. Crack. The sound was utterly foreign. A sharp, flat, metallic detonation that instantly severed the serene music of the cabin. Before Ada could even turn her head, a heavy lead slug shattered the thick wooden shutter of the front window, tearing through the heavy black pine logs in a shower of jagged, lethal splinters. The bullet slammed directly into the stone mantel inches from Ada's head, exploding in a shower of powdered granite and flattening into a twisted disk of hot lead on the hearth. Kalen moved before the deafening echo of the gunshot had even faded from the gorge. He dropped the oiled cloth. He lunged across the swept dirt floor, his massive frame moving with a terrifying, explosive speed, tackling Ada to the floorboards just as a second and third bullet tore through the heavy wooden door. "Stay down," Kalen roared, his voice completely devoid of the gentle, rumbling warmth it had held for months. The stone of the Bloodroot Range had returned in a fraction of a second, his pale, slate-gray eyes wild, feral, and blazing with a terrifying, holy wrath. Outside, the slushy, half-frozen mud of the yard was being violently churned by the heavy boots of several men. "Vance," the voice that floated over the rushing wind made Ada's stomach violently heave, the taste of morning chicory turning to pure, acidic bile in her mouth. It was Harlan. It was the voice of the freezing Main Street, of the crushing boot on her spine, of the tyrant who had laughed as she crawled in the filth. "Come out, you feral beast!" Harlan screamed, his voice thick with an ugly, desperate greed, amplified by the safety of the tree line. "You humiliated me in my own town. I've come for the rest of that raw mountain gold, and I've come for my property. Send the crippled bitch out here so I can break her other leg, or we'll burn you both to ash." Kalen rolled off ADA, keeping his massive body low to the dirt floor. He scrambled to the center of the room, his thick fingers finding the recessed iron ring of the root cellar trapdoor. He yanked it upward, exposing the dark, earthen hole. "Get in the dark," Kalen commanded, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles jumped wildly beneath his dark beard. He shoved his heavy, loaded Colt .45 revolver into her trembling hands. "Keep the steel pointed up. If the face looking down ain't mine, you empty the cylinder into it. Do you understand?" ADA stared at him, her chest heaving, the suffocating, ingrained terror of Harlan threatening to paralyze her limbs. She shook her head frantically, her wide eyes pleading with him not to go out into the crossfire. "They brought noise into my home," Kalen rumbled, turning his broad back to the door and pulling his massive, heavy-headed iron felling axe from its resting place on the log wall, holding the Winchester in his other hand. "I am going to silence them." He didn't wait for her to descend. He kicked the heavy oak front door entirely open with his iron-shod boot and stepped out onto the porch, a towering, nightmarish silhouette against the bright morning glare. "Fire! Bring the savage down!" Harlan yelled in panic. A ragged volley of rifle fire erupted from the jagged tree line. Bullets hammered the thick cabin logs, tearing massive splinters from the wood. Kalen didn't retreat inside for cover. He raised the heavy Winchester to his broad shoulder, working the lever with blinding, mechanical speed. Boom! Clack! Boom! The roar of the black powder was utterly deafening. A blinding flash of muzzle fire illuminated the gray shadows of the pines. A hired gun, 30 yards away with his rifle raised, took the brunt of the massive, heavy-grain lead slug directly in the center of his chest. The kinetic force punched him backward off his feet, launching him through the air, landing dead in the freezing, muddy slush. Kalen dropped the smoking rifle onto the porch. He didn't take the time to reload. He vaulted over the heavy timber railing, landing in the ankle-deep slush of the yard with a heavy, wet splash, the massive felling axe gripped tightly in his hands. He moved through the mud with a terrifying, unnatural speed. He met the first flanker before the man could draw his sidearm. Kalen swung the heavy felling axe in a brutal, horizontal arc. The flat iron back of the axe head crushed the man's ribs with a sickening crunch, sending him crashing into the mud, screaming in absolute agony. The yard became a chaotic, swirling nightmare of acrid sulfur, copper blood, and raw, visceral violence. Kalen was a force of nature, a feral demon unleashing years of suppressed, protective rage, systematically breaking the men who had dared to bring violence to his sanctuary. But in his feral, blood-soaked assault, the giant had been drawn down the steep slope, 50 yards away from the cabin walls. Harlan had not joined the charge in the mud. He was a coward who fought only women and the weak. While Kalen decimated the Hyatt gang, Harlan slipped around the jagged granite cliff face, moving toward the back of the cabin where a narrow window had been completely shattered by the crossfire. Inside the cabin, ADA had not gone down into the root cellar. She heard the deafening cracks of gunfire outside, the metallic scent of black powder drifting heavily through the open front door. Then, she heard the loud, unmistakable crunch of heavy boots on broken glass. Not outside, inside. ADA froze. She crouched beside the massive stone hearth, the heavy Colt revolver shaking violently in her hands. A man smelling of stale rye whiskey, stale sweat, and cheap tobacco was climbing clumsily through the shattered rear window. Harlan dropped heavily onto the dirt floor, his breathing ragged. His right hand gripped a rusted revolver. His small, cruel eyes darted wildly around the dim space, searching for the heavy canvas sack of gold. He turned toward the hearth, and he stopped dead, standing beside the sweltering stone hearth, leaning slightly on her smooth hickory walking stick but standing entirely upright, was Ada. She wasn't the shivering, weeping, fragile creature huddled in the freezing mud of Deadwood Creek. She was healthy, fully nourished, and standing with a fierce, immovable posture in the exact center of her home. Well, Harlan breathed, profound shock warring with his malicious greed. An ugly, vicious sneer twisted his thick lips. Look at the broken mule, playing house for the feral savage. Put the gun down, Ada. You don't have the spine for it. Tell me where the mountain gold is, and maybe I'll let you crawl down the mountain instead of blowing your head off. He took a step toward her, raising the rusted revolver, a leering, malicious intent in his eyes. He still saw a joke. He still saw a crippled victim he could crush beneath his boot. Ada didn't cower. She didn't weep. She looked at the man who had treated her like a beast of burden, who had humiliated her in front of a town simply because she had been born with a twisted bone. The suffocating, ingrained terror of her childhood vanished entirely, replaced by a blinding, white-hot inferno of absolute, protective rage for the sanctuary that had saved her. She was not a broken mule. She was the stone's wife. Ada didn't raise the heavy Colt revolver. Her finger was not strong enough to pull the stiff, heavy trigger of the massive weapon. Instead, she dropped the gun to the dirt. Her right hand swept down to the glowing coals of the hearth. Resting directly within the absolute hottest, deepest part of the fire was a massive, solid cast iron fire poker. The long iron shaft was blistering, the heavy, hook tip glowing a translucent, cherry red, radiating a lethal, searing heat. Harlan lunged forward, the rusted revolver aimed directly at her chest, reaching out to grab her hair. She swung. Ada channeled every single ounce of her fury, her humiliation, and the raw, unadulterated strength she had built hauling ash and chopping wood on the mountain into the strike. She ignored the agonizing throb in her twisted leg, pivoting entirely on her good foot. She brought the massive, blistering iron poker out from her side in a brutal, desperate, two-handed arc, putting the full, substantial momentum of her turning hips into the blow. Crack! The heavy, glowing iron flat of the scalding poker slammed directly into the side of Harlan's right kneecap. The sound of his patella shattering into a dozen jagged pieces was sickeningly loud, like a thick, dry branch exploding under the heavy wheel of a timber wagon. The cherry red iron seared instantly through his expensive wool trousers, vaporizing the flesh beneath with a horrific, violent sizzle. Harlan didn't just scream. He shrieked, a high, inhuman, piercing wail of absolute, paralyzing agony that tore his vocal cords. The rusted revolver flew from his deadened grip, clattering uselessly against the stone hearth. His leg collapsed completely inward at a grotesque, unnatural angle. He crashed heavily to the dirt floor, clutching his ruined, completely shattered joint, weeping and thrashing in the dust. He would never, ever walk upright again. Ada stood over him, her chest heaving, the breath hissing aggressively through her teeth. Her knuckles were stark white around the handle of the heavy iron poker, raising it in a threatening stance, the glowing tip still radiating an intense, lethal heat. She looked wild. She looked terrifying. She looked down at the screaming tyrant, her absolute, unbreakable strength reigning supreme over his pathetic, deafening agony. The heavy front door was suddenly filled with a massive, looming shadow. Kalen burst back into the room. He was a terrifying vision of absolute carnage. His chest was heaving, his canvas shirt soaked in the blood of the posse outside. The heavy felling axe in his hand dripped thick crimson onto the pristine floorboards. His pale, slate-gray eyes were wild with panic, expecting to find her bleeding on the floor. He looked at the shattered rear window. He looked at the screaming, writhing, broken tyrant in the dirt. And he looked at Ada. She stood tall, the heavy, smoking iron weapon still raised in her hands, her beautiful face flushed with exertion, her eyes blazing with a fierce, untamed fire. She met his shocked gaze, her breathing ragged but entirely steady, an unspoken, silent roar echoing loudly in the sweltering air of the cabin. Kalen didn't speak. He stepped forward, grabbed the screaming, permanently crippled tyrant by the collar of his heavy coat, and dragged him violently out the front door, hurling him off the edge of the porch to tumble down the rocky, slush-covered slope with the rest of his ruined posse. The sickening, wet, tumbling crunch of Harlan's heavy body hitting the jagged, slush-covered granite at the bottom of the ravine echoed faintly over the howling mountain wind, followed immediately by the frantic, panicked scrambling of the surviving hired guns. The men who could still draw breath around shattered ribs and crushed chests were already fleeing blindly down the treacherous, melting switchbacks, abandoning their horses, their weapons, and the wealthy tyrant who had brought him to the slaughter, surrendering him to the absolute, unforgiving mercy of the Bloodroot Range. He would never walk on that leg again, and he would never crawl out of that gorge. Kalen stood on the edge of the heavy wooden porch, a towering, blood-soaked monument against the blinding white glare of the morning snow. The feral, terrifying adrenaline that had fueled his wrath instantly evaporated into the freezing air, leaving a crushing, hollow exhaustion in its wake. The freezing wind bit at his massive chest, exposed through the shredded, blood-soaked ribbons of his canvas shirt, pulling the thick, corded muscles tight over his healing ribs. He turned slowly, his heavy, iron-shod boots dragging across the slush-covered floorboards as he stepped back over the threshold into the sweltering, smoke-filled heat of the cabin. Ada stood in the absolute center of the swept dirt floor. Her chest was heaving with exertion, her dark hair falling wildly around her shoulders. She opened her trembling hands. The massive, smoking cast-iron fire poker slipped from her grip, hitting the dirt floor with a loud, dull thud, the cherry-red, superheated iron hissing violently as it scorched the damp earth and filled the room with the acrid scent of burned dust. She didn't hesitate. She didn't shrink away from the gore coating his massive hands, or the wild, untamed violence that still radiated in heavy, suffocating waves from his towering frame. She ignored the dull, throbbing ache in her twisted right leg, hurrying to him with her pronounced, uneven gait, leaning confidently on the smooth-sanded hickory walking stick he had carved for her. Her soft, warm hands reached out to press directly against his heaving, blood-stained chest. Kalen let the heavy iron felling axe drop from his grip. It hit the dirt with a dense thud. He allowed her to guide him to the heavy wooden bench beside the scarred oak table, sinking onto the thick timber with a heavy, exhausted groan that rattled deep in his lungs. Ada fetched the tin wash basin, filling it from the heavy iron kettle that still steamed on the stone hearth. She grabbed a clean, soft linen rag and a cake of harsh lye soap. She returned to his side, her hands moving with a practiced, desperate urgency. She washed the thick, drying blood in the black, acrid soot of the gunpowder from his skin. Kalen hissed as the hot water hit a shallow, weeping bullet graze across his thick left bicep, his massive hands gripping the edge of the heavy oak table until his thick knuckles turned a stark, bone-white, but he didn't pull away. He didn't look at the wound. He looked at her hands. He looked at the delicate, bruised fingers that had just wielded boiling iron to permanently cripple the man who had tormented her. His pale slate eyes darkened with a profound, agonizing guilt. He reached up, his massive, heavily calloused fingers gently wrapping around her wrists, stopping the movement of the wet rag. "I brought this to your door," Kalen whispered, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that barely carried over the crackle of the hearth. He kept his eyes focused entirely on her hands, unable to look at her beautiful, fiercely expressive face. "I pulled you from that freezing mud, and I brought a slaughterhouse directly into your sanctuary. You kept us alive," Ada breathed, her voice steady and absolute, her uninjured hand resting heavily against the thick muscle of his arm. "You ended the men who tried to take our home." Kalen shook his head, the dark, wildly tangled hair falling over his heavily bearded cheek. He stood up, gently moving her hands away. He walked to the back of the cabin, dropping heavily to his knees on the dirt floor beside the massive bed of furs. He reached under the heavy timber frame and pulled out a thick, heavy leather satchel. He carried it to the table and dropped it. It hit the thick oak with an incredibly dense, metallic clang that rattled the tin plates on the wooden shelves. He untied the thick leather drawstrings. Inside, gleaming dully in the morning light filtering through the shattered front window, were dozens of heavy, raw nuggets of uncut mountain gold, the remainder of the massive strike he had pulled from the high bedrock. It was a king's ransom, a fortune forged in the absolute, punishing isolation of the peaks. Kalen pushed the heavy bag toward Ada. The pass will be completely clear of snow by tomorrow morning, Kalen rumbled, his voice turning flat, brittle, and completely devoid of the quiet, rumbling warmth they had shared over the long winter. He forced himself to stare blankly at the scarred wood of the table, his broad shoulders shaking violently with the sheer, monumental effort it took to maintain the lie of his indifference. The pack horse can carry you down the far side of the ridge. You won't have to go anywhere near Deadwood Creek. You can ride straight to the railhead in the next territory. Take the train east, to Chicago, or Boston. Ada froze, her breath catching painfully in her throat. Her dark eyes widened in absolute, terrified disbelief. I'm saying you're an incredibly wealthy woman now, he growled, the words tearing at his throat like swallowed glass. There's enough gold in that bag to buy a grand house. To hire servants to cook and clean for you so you never have to haul heavy ash again. You can wear silk dresses, sleep in soft beds, and hire the finest physicians in the world to look at that leg. You will never be shoved in the mud or treated as a burden again. You can be entirely safe. Ada's heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. She took a step toward the table, her hands gripping the thick wood, shaking her head in a desperate, frantic denial. Kalen, what are you saying? Look around, Kalen roared, the sudden, booming volume making her flinch backward. He gestured wildly to the splintered oak door, the blood staining the pristine floorboards, the shattered glass in the dirt. Does this look safe? I am a feral man, Ada. I live a brutal, dark life in the soot and the blood. I am a beast. I can't protect you from the world when I'm the very monster the world comes hunting to destroy. He looked at her then, his pale, slate-gray eyes swimming with a grief so profound, so devastatingly deep, it seemed to hollow out his massive chest entirely. You are too good for this, Dark, he whispered, his voice breaking, a single tear cutting a clean line through the soot and blood on his scarred face. Take the gold, go live in the light, where you will never have to hear the sound of gunfire or fight for your life again. Ada stared at the heavy leather sack. It was the answer to every desperate, weeping prayer of her agonizing youth. The absolute key to a life of unimaginable ease where she would never be mocked for her shortened leg, or treated as a useless, broken mule by cruel, laughing men. It was enough wealth to buy absolute perfection and safety. She looked at the heavy bag. She stepped forward and placed her hands upon it. She gripped the thick leather. The sack was incredibly heavy, pregnant with a terrifying amount of unrefined, raw wealth. Kalen closed his eyes, his massive chest caving in on itself. It is right, he told himself, fighting the agonizing, suffocating burn behind his eyelids. She deserves to be cherished in a soft, civilized place. She deserves a man who isn't covered in the blood of hired guns. Ada lifted the heavy bag. She did not walk to the bed to pack her clothes. She did not look toward the door. With a sudden, explosive surge of absolute, unyielding rage that rivaled his own feral fury, Ada held the heavy leather sack directly off the edge of the table. The heavy bag struck the packed earth with a tremendous crash. The thick drawstrings gave way, and a fortune in raw, heavy mountain gold spilled violently across the dirt, glittering uselessly among the sawdust and the blood. Kalen's eyes flew wide open. His jaw dropped, the breath rushing from his massive lungs in a stunned, disbelieving exhale. Woman, are you mad? That was your freedom. That was an entire world. Ada turned to face him. The bright, morning light framed her silhouette, but she did not look like a fragile, ruined girl from a freezing mining town. She looked like an absolute queen standing in the exact center of her own impenetrable fortress. She stood proudly, letting her weight rest naturally on her twisted, shortened leg and her custom hickory stick, completely unashamed of her stance. Freedom from what? She demanded, closing the distance between them with her pronounced, uneven stride, moving with sheer, undeniable purpose. From you, from the only man who ever looked at my broken bones and didn't see a burden to be crushed, but a woman to be worshipped. From the man who took a rotting wolf bite in a fever just to bring me fresh meat. She walked right up to him, invading his space, forcing the towering giant to look down into her fierce, tear-filled eyes. "You think a bag of metal makes me safe?" Ada asks, her voice trembling with an overwhelming, consuming love that dwarfed the fear of any bullet. "I lived in a civilized world, Kaelin, and they shoved my face in the freezing muck and laughed at my pain as a joke. I don't want a civilized life. I don't want a civilized man." She reached out, grabbing the thick canvas of his open, blood-stained shirt, and yanked downward with every ounce of her restored strength. He stumbled, his knees giving way under the sheer, unexpected force of her conviction. He fell heavily to his knees on the pine floorboards, his massive, heavily bearded face coming level with her waist. "I was treated like trash in the light," Ada whispered fiercely, her soft, warm hands coming up to gently cradle his massive, bearded, scarred face. She didn't flinch from the blood. She pressed her palms directly against his cheeks, pulling his head forward until his forehead rested gently against her stomach. "I found my true value in the wild. I am staying." Kaelin broke. The heavy, iron walls he had built around his soul for years, the punishing isolation he had sentenced himself to in the frozen peaks to hide from his own grief, shattered into fine, unrecognizable dust. A ragged, choking sob ripped out of his massive chest, a sound of such profound, agonizing release it physically shook the floorboards beneath them. He wrapped his thick, powerful arms entirely around her hips, burying his scarred face deeper into the soft, warm curve of her stomach, holding onto her with a desperate, holy reverence. "My Ada," he wept, the hot tears soaking into the fabric of her flannel shirt, washing away the cold, the blood, and the years of terrifying ghosts. "My wife, my heart, I am right here," she whispered, her fingers gently stroking his thick, dark, wildly tangled hair, feeling the violent trembling of his broad shoulders slowly begin to ease against her body. "The ghosts are dead, Kaelin. The mountain belongs to us now." He shifted, pulling back just enough to look up at her. He lifted his massive, rough hands, cupping her face with a tenderness that defied his terrifying size. He leaned forward and pressed his mouth directly against hers, a kiss of absolute, unshakable devotion, worshipping the very woman the world had deemed a broken, useless thing. He held her there in the ruins of the fight, the cold wind blowing through the shattered timber, the fire popping warmly in the massive stone hearth. The gold lay scattered and completely forgotten in the dirt, but as Kaelin Vance held the woman who had chosen his scarred darkness over the world's light, he knew with absolute, undeniable certainty that he had never been richer. The summer sun in the Bloodroot Range was a brilliant, blinding gold, turning the rugged, jagged granite into a warm, vibrant canopy of emerald pine and blooming mountain laurel. The cabin had fundamentally changed. It was no longer a dark, brooding den built for a solitary beast to hide his shame. The heavy black pine logs had been meticulously rechinked with bright, clean clay. A wide, wrap-around porch of smooth-sanded cedar had been added, facing the valley below, catching the warm southern drafts. The shattered front door had been replaced with one bearing beautiful, hand-forged iron hinges. The heavy scent of isolation was entirely gone, replaced by the constant, sweet aroma of baking bread, drying wild mint, and fresh pine shavings. On the porch, sitting on a heavy, wide-backed timber bench, was Kaelin. He wore a clean canvas shirt, the sleeves rolled up to expose his thick, heavily muscled forearms. The cold, dead slate of his eyes had been permanently replaced by a warm, watchful, incredibly deep peace. The terrifying, feral tension that had once defined his every movement was completely gone, replaced by the steady, unshakable calm of a man who knew exactly what he was protecting. Resting effortlessly against his massive, broad chest, supported entirely by his large, gentle hands, was a plump, giggling infant girl with a mop of thick, dark hair and bright, slate-gray eyes. The heavy oak door creaked open. Ada stepped out onto the porch. She wore a dress of soft, light blue cotton, the color open and loose. The fragile, exhausted girl from the freezing mud was a distant memory. She was radiantly, beautifully healthy, her dark hair pinned loosely up, catching the golden sunlight. She walked toward him, leaning comfortably on a newly carved, beautifully polished hickory walking stick that Kaelin had adorned with intricate, sweeping carvings of pine needles and hawk feathers. She didn't try to hide her pronounced limp. She moved with total, unshakable confidence, owning her stride with the grace of an absolute queen. She walked up beside the timber bench, resting her hand lightly on his broad shoulder, leaning down to press a soft kiss to his bearded cheek. She looked down at the baby, who was currently trying with absolute, focused determination to grab her father's thick beard. "She has your grip, Kaelin," Ada smiled, her fingers gently brushing the baby's dark hair. Kaelin chuckled, a deep, rich sound that vibrated in the warm air, echoing perfectly off the pines. "She's a Vance. She knows what is worth holding on to." Kaelin turned his head, capturing her lips in a soft, lingering kiss, tasting the sweet wild mint in the crisp mountain air. He didn't just kiss her, he held her entirely, leaning his head back against her arm, surrounded by the family he had thought he would never have. They stayed together on the porch, looking out over the jagged, beautiful wilderness that had once been a prison of grief for both of them. Far below, where the valley opened up, the mud and cruelty of Deadwood Creek had long since washed away, utterly forgotten. Up on the ridge, bathed in the light of the afternoon sun, the giant and his queen held everything that mattered, completely safe, wildly loved, and entirely, perfectly free.